Hello friends, my name is JJ, and welcome to my 600th video. Wow. And in honor of this historic milestone, today I thought I would do what I do best and give you a 25-minute summary of the last few months of Canadian politics. So when we last left off, back in May of 2025, Mark Carney had just been elected Prime Minister of Canada. Carney's rise to this country's top job was one of the most remarkable stories in Canadian political history, just because he achieved such tremendous success in such an incredibly short period of time. It's not a stretch to say that little over a year ago, most Canadians had never even heard of him. Carney had been an international banker and bureaucrat for most of his adult life, with jobs that entailed spending many years outside of Canada. His election as Prime Minister was the first political office he ever sought, and came after he lived most of the last decade in England. What this means in practice is that a lot of Canadians are still basically in the process of getting to know him, and it's probably fair to say that he is still in something of an extended honeymoon period. His personal approval numbers are still very high, and are indeed higher than that of the Liberal Party he leads. Carney was elected in April of 2025 in a campaign that was dominated by anti-Trump and anti-American rhetoric. This was in large part because the Canadian election happened barely 100 days into Donald Trump's second presidency, which had been defined by weird and unprovoked belligerence towards Canada. Shortly after he assumed office, Trump began vowing to impose brutal tariffs on this country and mused about taking it over altogether. In Canadian political culture, the Liberal Party tends to be the more reliably anti-American and nationalistic of Canada's two main parties. After Carney became head of the Liberals in March, he was eager to introduce himself to the country as a prime ministerial candidate willing to make it his defining mission to fight back against Trump and the Americans more generally.
The Americans want our strength. They want our resources. They want our water. They want our land. They want our country. They want our country. They do. Never.
We need to fight Trump's tariffs with counter tariffs of our own that cause maximum damage in the United States with minimum impact here.
He said his conservative opponent, meanwhile, could not be trusted to guard Canadian independence or Canadian values because he was too much like Trump himself. Carney had this whole slogan of elbows up against the Americans, which is apparently an old-fashioned hockey reference of some sort. Though honestly, a lot of Canadians that I spoke to, even big hockey fans, told me they found it sort of confusing and counterintuitive. Certainly a lot of conservatives were quick to characterize it as liberal cringe at its worst. But the conservatives were also clearly caught flat-footed by the dominance of US-Canada relations in the election campaign, which was not remotely their preferred issue. But Carney spoke it fluently, and he revived his party's lagging poll numbers and won the Liberals a fourth term. During his 9 months in office, Carney has so far been keen to define himself as a prime minister who will lead Canada into a new economic era where our traditional dependence on the United States is lessened, and we instead trade much more with the rest of the world, and indeed, ourselves. I'm sure a lot of you heard about this big speech that Carney gave at the World Economic Forum the other day. He laid out a rather dark vision of a world that was becoming more cutthroat and mercenary, which he heavily implied was largely because the United States had decided to abandon its reliability as a friendly ally and guardian of a predictable, rules-based international order.
We know the old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy.
The speech impressed and even shocked a lot of the world with its bluntness and eloquence, though it's worth remembering that Carney constantly talks this way all the time about everything.
This decades-long process of an ever closer economic relationship with the United States is now over.
We need to keep moving with speed and determination, because the upheaval in the global trading system is not a transition, it's a rupture.
Threats from a more dangerous and divided world are unraveling the rules-based international order.
A 60-year period of close cooperation, partnership, job growth, and prosperity. And that era has now ended.
He's particularly fond of this idea that we are in the midst of a new world order.
Sets us up well for the new world order.
In which old alliances and rivalries should be revisited, which I think is a mission that he personally feels quite comfortable with, as someone who has lived in all of these different countries and spent so much time networking with international big shots. Carney has made a very large number of overseas trips during his first year as prime minister, including multiple trips to Europe and the Middle East, and a very high-profile visit to China last month. The problem, however, is that these trips do not yet seem to be yielding much in the way of actual deals. The Chinese trip was probably his most fruitful, but even it only concluded with a rather narrow transactional agreement wherein the Chinese agreed to buy more Canadian canola in exchange for the Canadians agreeing to buy more Chinese electric cars. And this seems to be shaping up to be one of Carney's big challenges. A lot of countries just don't care as much about Canada as Carney cares about them. Carney might be keen to offer up Canada as an eager participant in some new, less sentimental global order seeking to offset American power, but other countries are still going to pursue whatever relationship with America they think makes most sense for them. We saw some of this in the aftermath of his World Economic Forum speech, wherein the leaders of Britain and India, amongst others, insisted that they believed that a close relationship with the US was still very much possible and desirable. But despite it all, maintaining a close relationship with the US theoretically remains one of Carney's main foreign policy objectives too. 2026 is the year that he's supposed to renegotiate the so-called USMCA free trade agreement with the Trump administration, and his government says it's ready and willing to do so. The maintenance of free trade with the US is critical for Canada's economic well-being, but given all of his anti-American rhetoric, Carney will also have to worry about outraging his anti-Trump base if he's seen as giving away too much. But on the other hand, Carney's proven track record of overt American skepticism might also make him uniquely qualified to sell a renewed or even expanded trade deal with the US without inflaming fears of lost Canadian sovereignty. The bigger political concern from all of this stuff, however, is whether Canadians will feel any real-world economic consequences from all of these deals that Carney is or isn't getting. Because at the end of the day, Carney isn't pursuing a robust trade agenda because he likes the way it sounds. He's doing it because he thinks it will actually improve the lives of Canadians in some tangible way, especially in the context of a generally poorly performing Canadian economy. Which leads us to the other part of the agenda that Carney has eagerly been pursuing thus far: building Canada strong. Carney represents a type of 21st century liberal that I feel has been rising a lot in influence over the last few years. The aggressive YIMBY. These are people who believe that one of the big things that's been holding liberalism back lately is an obsession with regulation and procedure at the expense of economic development, particularly the construction of physical economic infrastructure like roads and mines and power plants and pipelines. As a result, last June, Prime Minister Carney got the Parliament to pass what he clearly intends to be one of his signature pieces of legislation, the Building Canada Act. This statute gives the federal government broad authority to ignore many pieces of Canadian law that are seen as being bureaucratic obstacles to the construction of large-scale infrastructure projects. This includes laws regulating the protection of the environment and wildlife, as well as more general laws prescribing long and complicated procedures for building things like mines and power plants. It's a pretty dramatic piece of legislation that makes the executive branch much more powerful, and the fact that it wasn't considered all that controversial really says something about the growing YIMBY consensus in Canada. Over the next few months, the Carney administration unveiled a list of over a dozen so-called major projects that his government would be using its new powers to fast-track, including a liquefied natural gas plant here in British Columbia, a copper mine in Saskatchewan, a nuclear power plant in Ontario, and a hydroelectric dam in Nunavut. It's an impressive, tangible checklist and a rare example of a politician offering the public a metric through which to measure his own success. Carney can only go so far in actually making these things happen, however. The private corporations contracted to build these projects have to remain confident that there's still a business case to see them through, which has sometimes been a problem in the past. And there are still two realms of potential political opposition that even the most Yimby Prime Minister cannot easily override, namely the provincial governments and the indigenous governments of various First Nations. The latter, in particular, I think is his biggest potential headache, just because, as we learned in JJ video number 598, Carney has been trying really hard to portray himself as the great friend of the Indigenous Canadians and someone who would never ever ride roughshod over their opposition to any unauthorized use of their lands. And I'm not even being sarcastic. I think this is a legit problem that he's boxed himself into, particularly since the Canadian courts have gotten a lot more sympathetic to First Nations litigants these days. So if some of these Native organizations sue to stop the projects, there's a lot of reason to suspect they might be successful. Alrighty, now let us check in on the Conservative Party. How have they been doing since last year's election? Well, under leader Pierre Poilievre, they're in a bit of a difficult pickle. On the one hand, Pierre has been pretty popular and effective as a Conservative leader. He is a politician who is affirmatively quite well liked by his party and offers a clear and disciplined message about affordability, jobs, taxes, housing, and now increasingly immigration too. A large and loyal donor base means that the Conservatives are now also the richest party in Canadian history. In terms of his share of the popular vote, Pierre is more popular than any Conservative who has run for Prime Minister of Canada in nearly 40 years, and that includes former three-term Prime Minister Stephen Harper. This is a testament to Pierre's success at broadening the appeal of the Conservative Party, particularly in making it the party of preference for young people in Canada, which is a pretty dramatic cultural shift and something that few other Conservative parties elsewhere in the world have been able to achieve. The problem, however, is that Pierre is simultaneously very disliked by a majority of Canadians in a way that feels kind of permanent and irresolvable. A lot of people find him shrill and mean and annoying, but to a large extent, this feels inseparable from the degree that they just don't like Conservatives in general. A revealing illustration of this came out in a recent poll where self-identified open-minded voters were asked what Pierre could do to win their votes. Saying he should change his tone was popular, but the most popular response was that he should talk more about so-called kitchen table issues. Now, people can hate Pierre for any number of reasons, but I think it is a little bizarre to suggest that he is somehow not talking enough about middle-class economic anxieties, given he very consciously built his whole political brand around that topic.
Prices are rising faster today than they were when Mark Carney took office, promising to lower them.
House prices have doubled in 7 years, up 100%.
Getting rid of these taxes and deficits will lower the cost of gas, heat, and groceries, and will bring down interest rates so that Canadians can afford their mortgage payments once again.
So it becomes hard to shake the impression that at some level, the number of Canadians who are just fundamentally not interested in him is kind of immovable. And so he might just be the victim of entrenched polarization in a country that is majority center-left. In any case, in late January, Pierre was overwhelmingly affirmed by the Conservative Party to once again stand as their candidate for Prime Minister in the next election. This will make him the first failed Conservative leader to run for a second time in over 20 years. That same day, he gave a very well-received speech to the party faithful, in which he doubled down on his standard pitch to thunderous applause.
Canadians cannot afford life under the Liberal government.
And I think both of these facts sort of startled some Canadian political observers a bit. When a party loses an election, the aftermath of that loss can often be a very divisive time. And yet the Conservatives seem as united as they've ever been around a single leader, a single message, and a single strategy. But again, I just want to emphasize that in the context of the present moment, this is not necessarily irrational, since Pierre is the only leader of the last decade who has produced success for his party on this scale, even if that success remains stubbornly short of victory. Now, there is a line that I'm sure I have used in a past video when it comes to describing the New Democratic Party of Canada, a left-wing party that never comes remotely close to winning power and currently has a mere 7 seats in the parliament after facing an even more crushing defeat than usual in the last election. What I like to call the NDP is the most relevant, irrelevant variable in Canadian politics. What I mean by that is that even though the NDP has never, and probably will never win power in Canada, its mere existence on the fringe of the entrenched Canadian two-party system can nevertheless exert a big impact on Canadian election outcomes in a sort of butterfly effect sort of way. When the NDP does well, it is almost always because progressive voters are feeling some degree of disillusion with the Liberal Party. That then results in a small but significant hemorrhaging of Liberal votes, which then splits the centre-left and allows the Conservatives to win. So the shifting preferences of a small faction of far-left voters can have huge consequences for who runs Canada, and paradoxically means that the Conservatives have a vested interest in seeing a strong leftist movement in this country. For their part, the NDP faithful have also spent much of the last decade hoping that a strong leftist populist movement will emerge in Canada. A lot of NDPers have been very excited by the popularity of people like Bernie Sanders and AOC, and more recently Zoran Mamdani in the States. And there has been this persistent hope that a similar figure will eventually emerge in Canada. Jagmeet Singh, the old NDP leader, tried to market himself as this kind of character, and the people currently running to replace him have all made a big deal about how inspired they are by the democratic socialist movement in America as well. And I could do a whole video on why I don't think this has worked. For one, I think that after a decade of rule by Justin Trudeau, there is probably a sense among a lot of voters that the Liberal Party is more or less progressive enough. I heard one of the NDP leadership candidates the other day describe the Liberal Party as far right. I just think that's not a very mainstream take. I think even Mark Carney, who is more conservative than Trudeau, still has a degree of forward-looking energy and freshness to him that makes him quite different from some dreary establishment figure like Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. I think it's also just probably true that there's a bit of a lack of good left-wing populist issues to rally around in Canada. Canada already has Medicare for all. Canada doesn't have much to do with Israel. Canada's economy is dominated by a lot of large corporations, but the Canadian left tends to accept this as a permissible price to pay if it means keeping even larger American corporations out of the country. Realities like this can leave the NDP without many interesting things to talk about. Like, they can say that they want to help fight for working families and help with the cost of living and all of that, but the Liberals and the Conservatives say that stuff too. And of course, the Canadian left's deep dislike of Pierre Poilievre has almost certainly made progressive voters more strategic. I mean, at this point, the fact that the NDP contributes to vote splitting isn't exactly some deep, dark, esoteric secret of Canadian politics. As I mentioned, the NDP is currently in the midst of an election to pick their new leader, and I think it's safe to say that this contest hasn't exactly captivated the imaginations of Canadians. The two frontrunners are Heather McPherson, who is a three-term NDP Member of Parliament from Edmonton, and somebody who I would say doesn't really have a particularly strong identity beyond being a loyal NDP foot soldier, and Avi Lewis, who has never held elected office before, but is nevertheless a very establishment figure in the party since both his father and grandfather were NDP leaders. My sense is Avi is probably the slightly more interesting and dynamic of the two, but both of them are, in their own way, quite small c conservative choices who, in my opinion, reflect a party that a lot of Canadians are just kind of getting bored of. Surprises can happen in Canadian politics, of course, but at this point, the NDP's got to be hoping that one of these guys has a pretty big one up their sleeve. Originally, I wasn't even going to make this video until the new NDP leader was picked, but that is not scheduled to happen until the end of March, which is another good example of how the NDP can be a relevant, irrelevant variable, because the last thing I want to talk about is election fever. Prime Minister Carney has earned a reputation for being a bit of a Frank Underwood-style political schemer. In fact, I would say that he's probably the first Canadian Prime Minister who I could imagine someone making an interesting movie about. In addition to just kind of swooping in from nowhere and taking charge of the country following Justin Trudeau's resignation, he's also proving quite the skilled practitioner of behind-the-scenes politicking as well. In the 2025 election, Carney just barely failed to win a majority of seats in the Parliament, which is considered a must for effective prime ministers in Canada, since it guarantees passage of all of your legislation and protects you from the threat of a no-confidence vote. Carney accordingly spent the next few months attempting to convince members from other parties to switch sides, but he only converted 2, which wasn't quite enough. At the same time, Carney has proved himself quite effective at getting rid of certain liberal politicians who he clearly saw as liabilities. Ministers Stephen Guilbeault, Bill Blair, and his main rival in the Liberals, former Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, have all conveniently quit his administration, often to take jobs in other countries, which has removed a lot of the more controversial Trudeau-era people from his hair. It hasn't, however, helped with his pursuit of his elusive parliamentary majority. But what if there had to be a special emergency election right now, right when the Prime Minister's poll numbers were hitting record highs? Oh ho ho! Delightfully devilish, Carney. This is the big gossip in the Canadian news media right now, that Carney will use his powers as Prime Minister to force an emergency election sometime soon, win that election even more decisively than before, and, having finally secured a solid parliamentary majority, actually get around to ruling Canada as a truly transformative Prime Minister. Probably assisted by a new and better cabinet assembled from a bunch of fresh and dynamic parliamentarians, not just Trudeau's sloppy seconds. The reason the NDP matters to all of this is because they don't have a leader right now, and never in Canadian history has a Prime Minister purposefully instigated an election when one of the big 3 parties are without a candidate for Prime Minister. It's not a law, but it's the kind of gentlemanly agreement that I don't think even a guy as scheming as Carney would break. But that means that if he does force an election, it would have to be sometime after the NDP election on March 29th. Maybe, say, on April 28th? The 1-year anniversary of the 2025 election. That would make Carney's first term very short, but not the shortest term ever for an elected prime minister. It would certainly invite all sorts of outrage that he was manipulating the election calendar for partisan gain, something Justin Trudeau faced a lot of flack for when he did it back in 2021. But then again, Trudeau was not popular, and Carney is. But that's all just speculation. For now, all you need to know about Canadian politics is that Carney is riding high, the NDP is riding low, and the Conservatives are riding in some sort of Schrodinger's cat-esque limbo of simultaneous success and failure. Oh, and Justin Trudeau is apparently dating Katy Perry now. What do you think will happen in Canadian politics in 2026? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for sticking with me for 600 videos, and I will see you next week.